Brandy, thank you so much for coming on the GeoTrek podcast. I'm so excited. I could hardly sleep last night. You're such a great communicator with emergency management, all these disaster things. I just thought this is going to be a really great podcast.
You're too kind. Thank you for having me.
Brandy, so you have this interesting background in emergency management, but also law, right? So that it's like this multidimensional professional thing going on. How did your interest in those fields develop? And then walk us through your journey to get into those fields.
Well, I'll say if anybody looks at my LinkedIn profile, and that is not a shameless plug, my career is kind of varied, but looking back on it, it makes sense. So it started, I was a public affairs, a photojournalist in the Army way back when. And when I got out of the service, then I went into public relations. I did some journalism, public relations, marketing. And then I started maybe about, I don't know, 10 years ago, kind of getting an interest in specializing in crisis PR. And that was kind of around the rise of the internet, the interwebs, and the 24/7 news cycle. And I started to develop a keen interest in that, which led me to being the lead public information officer for GEMA, which is Georgia's emergency management agency. So I was their lead PIO for a couple of years. And that's where the love for emergency management really came in. I think it probably drew on my military background, that having a specific mission, having a duty, and then it merged, my communications background as well. So while I was there, I took all the classes and learned as much as I could and became a certified emergency manager in Georgia. And fingers crossed, in a few weeks, I'll have the International Association of Emergency Managers designation of a CEM. But when I got into emergency management, I've always had an interest in law and how it intersected with PR. Lawyers and PR people are always your two people at the table when anything bad happens in the world. But especially in disasters, I really saw how politics and law affected and changed or could change disaster response, or what you could say or what you couldn't say. And at that point of my life, I was like, I am tired of fighting with lawyers. Be right back. I'm going to go become one. And so, because I really wanted the knowledge, it wasn't so much about like, I want to be a lawyer so I can beat you. It was like, what do they have that makes leaders and CEOs listen to them when I'm also on the other side of the table going, you can't do that. You can't say that. And I really wanted to understand that at a deeper level.
Brandy, how did you see this playing out with like lawyers involved with the conversations in emergency management, public relations at the state and local level? I mean, how did you see lawyers and the legal side coming into play?
Words. I'll start with words first. I'm kind of a straightforward, direct person. The first time I ever saw an elected official really do communication the way that I would want to do it was Rick Scott in Hurricane Michael. And he was like, you need to leave. This storm will kill you. You need to go. And I was like, yes, that's how we should be communicating. But of course, legal and elected officials and leaders, the whole gamut would be like, you can't say that. You have to just give them the information and tell them there's an evacuation and let them decide. And I was like, we need more risk communication. And when lawyers get involved, it's more public information. But if you kind of let emergency managers say what we really want to say, it's really more risk communication. And there's just kind of an intersect there that happens behind the scenes that a lot of people don't see.
Do you feel like that risk communication sometimes is more direct, more dire? You need to get out of harm's way, as opposed to maybe the legal conversations, which are like, wait, we have to be careful about every word we say.
Yes, I think risk communications is a little bit more in-depth than that, but I feel like there's a gap in, yes, we're giving people the information, the forecast, here's the evacuation order, but we're giving it to them very plainly. And I really think that there needs to be an element of, if you are accepting this risk, these are the potential hazards. And just saying, turn around, don't drown, or don't drive through standing water, or using terms, and this is in your field house, how storm surge, people don't know what that means. People need to see and hear stories or see photographs of, let's say, the most recent memory, Hurricane Ian. God forbid, when the next storm comes, we need to show people what storm surge looks like and what risk they're accepting. You know, either people don't have the capacity because information comes at them from a million different places. So they don't have the capacity to understand the risk, or they don't have the experience, they don't have the context that goes with it. And I feel like that's greatly missing. And it does keep me up at night sometimes because I feel like some people might not have suffered as greatly as they have if they had truly understood the risks that were in front of them.
So, Brandy, it sounds like you're saying the more accurate, vivid picture that we can paint for people, if you stay, this is what you're looking at as far as death and destruction, casualties. I mean, complete obliteration of the landscape is what we saw there in Southwest Florida and Hurricane Ian. You mean painting that a little clearer for people, like this is the risk you're accepting by staying, may help people make a better informed decision?
Yes, and I'm saying that very directly. There are some considerations that I would put into that. I wouldn't just bombard people with 24/7 images of, death and destruction. There's some trauma considerations there that need to be brought to the forefront. But yes, I do think that there are ways to incorporate those images or those stories at the right time to help people really understand. But I also understand the time constraints, these rapidly intensifying storms that we're seeing in the last few years. There might not be time for a long drawn out campaign of selectively putting the right images at the right time. It's just risk comms. You need to go. This storm will kill you or can kill you.
Brandy, the work that emergency managers do is so important for that. I think you mentioned in a conversation we had about the important work that broadcast meteorologists do as well. What's their role? I mean, do they have the ability to maybe be more direct in some ways with some of these things because they're not government employees?
Possibly. So, way back in my career, I was a journalist and I did PR. So I worked with lots of news stations and worked in lots of newsrooms. If their producers, editors, and their news company will let them, yes. They also have bosses to answer to. But I think, from an emergency management standpoint, we always tell people, follow your local meteorologist. They are going to know what is predicted for your area. Pardon me. And so I think they are in a prime position, and they're the ones that people turn to, people are friends with. The local communities know them and trust them. And so presuming that, their newsrooms and their producers and, their big corporate owners let them, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, often they really do have a trusted voice. They have not only weather knowledge, but local weather knowledge of how this plays out in this urban area, in this coastal area, whatever it is. And often they do have a strong science background. They can maybe help walk us through some of these things as well. Brandy, getting back to emergency management, I know we have layers at the federal level, state level, local level. How are those different layers similar to each other, and how are they different?
So the National Incident Management System, under FEMA, has an incident command structure, and that structure is scalable. It can be done for a small event, that's just a few people, or a very localized event, but it can scale up to something as large as Deepwater Horizon, or Hurricane Michael or Hurricane Matthew. And so the response and how the operations centers look and the functions that each division or branch or group plays, those are all pretty much the same. So I can walk into any EOC and understand how it's laid out if they follow that structure. So whether I'm walking into a field office at FEMA that's responding, usually they embed in the state SOCs, but I can walk into FEMA and understand how they're responding, or I can walk into a city or a county operations center and understand how they're operating. So it's very standardized, and it's also scalable.
Oh, that's interesting. So it sounds like it's repeatable. It's basically there's a standardized format to how this is structured, who's at the table, who's talking, and those are a lot of the similarities. What are some differences between them, or is it pretty much the same thing, just repeated at different scales?
So I'll give you a little anecdote here. When I first started working in emergency management, I was naive to lots of things. And I had this presumption that, at the city and the county level, they did things a certain way. And then if the state got involved, oh, the state's in charge. And it was very, very fast. The biggest light bulb moment for me is that the larger that an incident gets, like if the state gets involved, the state activates, the state becomes a support function. Disasters are local, they start in local. And so the state, yes, they're providing resources and doing everything, and they're following the ICS structure, but they become a support function for your localities and municipalities once an incident or an event is so large that local infrastructure and resources can't support it. And so it was very fascinating for me to understand that it wasn't the state comes in to take charge, the state comes in to help.
Oh, that's really interesting. I would have thought of it maybe like the state's coming over to take over. That's not what's happening. You're saying really the response is local. The state's saying we're there to support you. You may need additional resources.
Yes, absolutely. And the same with federal. A lot of times your federal partners will deploy to a region, or they'll deploy and embed, with your state operations center, but they're there to help. They're not there to take over. They're there to, okay, local emergency manager, what do you need? You need food and water, and you need emergency shelters. Great, we will help you. And so it really is kind of like having a bunch of bodyguards, right? I'm just using some Hollywood visual. It's like something gets so big you can't do it, and then the heavies come in and they're like, we got you, we'll help.
Yeah, they provide that support. And we've seen if you've been on the ground in a catastrophe, sometimes it's very clear there's no way just the local resources could handle all this. It's just overwhelming. Brandy, you've spoken about the 6 most dangerous words in emergency management communication. What are they, and why is this so important?
So I think they're the 6 most dangerous words in any profession, but I like to bring them home a little bit. And they are, I'm going to use quotes, that's the way it's always been. There's processes, procedures, standard operating procedures, all those sorts of things. And they're very standardized, and they're passed down, from iteration to iteration, employees to employees. And I understand that if it's not broken, don't fix it. I totally get that. But I think that when you have a mindset that prohibits you from maybe making your life a little easier or freeing up some capacity, or this mindset that just dismisses any ideas coming your way with, well, that's the way we've always done it. I feel like that's a real disservice to your community and to your fellow employees.
Brandy, how do you navigate that? I mean, that's so common. I heard that this last week. I was talking to some weather professionals about how we map hurricanes. And this cone of uncertainty from the Hurricane Center, it shows the position of the eye. It implies to most people that's where the most dangerous part is. Actually, the eye, you can make an argument that's kind of the western periphery of the impacts. The impacts go far outside to the right of the eye track. So there have been a lot of conversations lately about changing that. And I actually heard someone say, hey, for 75 years, that's how we've done it, right? So how do you navigate that when people say this is the way it's always been?
So that's where that's the area of fascination for me. I think it comes down to communication, and I think it comes down to risk communication. Like, okay, that's the way it's always been, but let me tell you the risk that you're accepting in doing it that way. You have 100+ deaths, or the potential for, you start pulling data and statistics. You have the potential for lawsuits. You have the potential for this. So, once you start getting data and information that tells you, or people that are telling you, look, this is not working, I think you need to remove that's the way it's always been from any conversation, or even from your mindset. And I really think that leaders and people in general need to make space for those new ideas, because the practitioners on the ground, they're the ones that can tell you exactly how to do it the best way, the most efficient way. Listen to them. It might not roll up into something that works well at a higher level, but creating that inclusive space for people to bring their ideas has value. And in our profession, that value can save lives and resources.
I imagine if you have well-defined goals as well, if your goal is to save as many lives as possible, right? Showing the position of the hurricane eye may not be as target on with your goals as showing the storm surge inundation map, right? So I mean, it comes down to maybe if we have well-defined goals and say, okay, how do we get to those goals? Maybe then that's kind of a backdoor way we can say, okay, we want to make some change, but not just for the sake of making change, but to reach our goals of saving lives. Brandy, we're watching Hurricane Ian come in. It's 2022. We have so much technology. We have the technology to see clouds coming off the coast of Africa now. We don't get blindsided in the same way we did 100 years ago from these hurricanes that came.
1989 in the middle of the Gulf.
That was. I think the satellites were down that night. There was some night there was a family. We saw their boat on the satellite trying to get to safety. But in general, we have so much information. We expect we're not going to be blindsided as much. And here we have Hurricane Ian, where it looks like we have more than 100 deaths. I mean, walk us through what's been going through your mind with that. It seems like it was a natural catastrophe. Now there's been a lot of talk about, was it handled well from a response perspective? I mean, this is your area of expertise. I mean, what are your thoughts as you saw this storm? Do you see any maybe changes coming out of this? Just share your thoughts with us.
Sure. My thoughts are wide and vast. I'm going to put a couple of disclaimers in there, which is I haven't dug very deeply into policies and laws and regulations. I'm really looking at it from a lens of what I'm seeing online, and not just news media, but also survivors, their social media posts, local meteorologists. So I haven't dug in too deeply, but from the 30,000 foot view, I think there's a lot of things at play. I think there, a rapid intensification of a storm. Sure. I think, maybe not understanding full risk. You and I have talked about this previously. There's also some psychological considerations in communication, which are anchoring, which is people kind of hold on to the first bit of outlier information that they hear. So in the beginning of this storm, and this is not absolute, this is just what I saw. Most people saw Tampa and everything else just didn't compute. Yeah. And there wasn't a lot of time to keep checking. It was just Tampa, and here's this cone of uncertainty, making people think this is where the storm is going to hit, when really that's just the eye. It does not show the magnitude of the winds and the wind field and the flooding and the rain and all the water it's going to pick up, out in the Gulf before it gets there. So I think there's a lot of elements that go into it. Lack of time, anchoring. The other psychological kind of term is milling effect. And that's kind of the old school, like, hey man, did you hear there's a storm coming? What are you going to do? Are you staying? Are you leaving? Well, that all happens online now. That happens in Facebook groups or texts or things like that. But nobody's going to hear an emergency manager go, get out, and then leave. They're going to ask their friends and see what the other people's opinions are, maybe call their local TV station. People are going to, which is good. We want people to do due diligence and question things and learn and get context. But there's a time where it's like, you don't have any time left. You need to go.
Brandy, it sounds like you're saying people prefer to have this time to process, where they hear the evacuation order, they call their grandma, they call their friends, they start, if 8 out of 10 of their social network is leaving, they're maybe going to leave. If 1 out of 10 is leaving, maybe they won't. It's this sense that we're more connected than we may realize to the feedback from others in our community. But it also sounds like you're saying in a storm like this, where the track was quite uncertain and it shifted quite a bit toward the end and came in really fast, maybe people didn't have as much time for all that milling to take place. The storm was on their doorstep and they needed to take action.
Sure. And, there's lots of legal, if you would, or policy considerations in that too, Hal. So for instance, if there is not a mandatory evacuation order, and I don't know the laws of Florida, I'm speaking in generalities here, but in most places, if there is not a mandatory evacuation order and you choose to evacuate, your job doesn't necessarily have to hold your job for you. So if your boss says, nope, you got to come into work, it's not a mandatory evacuation, nobody's going to, it's rare you're going to find somebody that goes, okay, I can lose my job over this. They need that economic stability. They need a job. And so if the leaders don't issue those kind of orders and make those decisions, then it becomes a lot more complicated for people to even do the logistics in their own lives in order to leave.
Brandy, I pulled into Southwest Florida the day before landfall. I had 10 days food, 10 days water, all this extra gasoline. I anticipated a ghost town. I come in and it's just completely fully functioning. Publix was open till 6 p.m. the day before landfall. If you're a cashier, are you going to say, sorry, y'all, I'm leaving? The massage parlors, the barber shops, the swimming pool supply company. I was going down the strip mall just looking at all of these businesses, all of them open. So again, that makes a hard case for people to say, defy their employer and say, sorry, even though it's not mandatory, even though things are open, I'm leaving anyway.
Right. It does make it very difficult. And, if schools don't close, people have lots of dynamics in their lives, work, school, family members in the hospital. There's lots of dynamics at play in each individual person's life. People might not have money in the bank to travel, for an evacuation that may, for a storm that may or may not hit. And, if you don't have the leaders telling you, like, get out, you need to leave, then you kind of make that presumption that everything's okay. Conversely, coming out of 2 years of COVID response, which is, you don't have enough podcast hours for that conversation, but people also are a little gun shy. There were parts of COVID, where people are like, oh my God, you got to leave or you're going to die. And rightfully so. There was some science out there at certain times that made those really big announcements relevant. But, if people survived all that and survived previous storms, then it's kind of like the boy crying wolf. And so, there's just lots of psychological and community trauma things at play.
I see where people may say, look, the authorities, the media, everything's always the end of the world. We're going to be fine. We've ridden out all these storms. We've ridden out the pandemic. We've learned to just not listen to the authorities or the media. And all of a sudden, it makes it complex for a case like this where a 12-foot storm surge is just going to rip apart a city. It's going to be a dire thing. Brandy, could you walk us through, in general terms, why may a county or a local entity delay an evacuation order? I mean, why not just order this way out in front? Just in general terms, what are the incentives to waiting a little bit longer?
Sure. And this is not all inclusive. And again, this is not specific to any county. However the state is structured, each county or municipality or state laws kind of govern all of it. But there's a couple of things at play. One, it kind of depends on your city or county charter. One thing that really stuck out to me I won't name counties, in one of the counties in Florida, is that their emergency operations plan had a very specific evacuation triggers, which is not a bad thing. As emergency managers, I'm like, yes, if this, then this, great, nobody gets to fight about it. And maybe they didn't follow those, or I didn't read them. So you might have binding documents that prevent those sorts of things. You also have, let's say you have two counties side by side. One county's like, well, we're going to do a mandatory evacuation, and the other county's like, we're not. Then you have conflicting information. And so so sometimes it's kind of like, well, what's my friend over there in XYZ County going to do? And county managers and states know that as soon as you issue an evacuation order, some other county is going to get your people and their infrastructure is going to be burdened. And so it's kind of a conversation that has to be had, like, hey, just let you know, a bunch of people are heading your way. But you also have cost. So disaster funding, federal funding for a federally declared disaster, all of that funding comes after, and state, funds for disaster. All of the money comes after. They might do a state of emergency beforehand, but that just means, hey, we agree that you can use whatever resources you need over time for public safety, whatever. That checkbook is open as you need it. But the money comes after. If there's not a state of emergency or a declared disaster, then the county or, the local municipality oftentimes is on the hook for that expense. So it's like, we can activate a bunch of people, we can tell people to evacuate, we can shut down businesses and take the economic impact. But if that storm turns, we're on the hook for all of that overtime pay, for all of those resources, for the economic impacts. And so it's very valid that there might be like do we want to risk $10 million in losses just in case the storm might not hit us or get weakened? And so it's kind of you're sitting there hedging bets.
It seems like a delicate balancing act if you're on the edge of those potential hurricane tracks, right? Where you're saying, well, if this does turn and we did a mandatory evac, we shut down the government offices, we opened up shelters, we're paying police overtime because we have curfews. I mean, there are all these different expenses that comes into play. You're saying if the storm turns and you never really got strong winds or flooding, you may not be part of that disaster declaration post-storm and not get reimbursed for it. You might be out a lot of money.
You might be out, individual assistance money, hazard mitigation grant program money, public assistance money, and a lot of times states will do state governments will do states of emergency so that the state can maybe be on the hook for some of that. But,
Sure.
It's not a full refund. And it depends on so many different factors there. But holistically looking at it, yes, do we want to be on the hook? Do our taxpayers want to be on the hook?
Sure.
And there's also the consideration of, if we cry wolf again and the storm turns, then people aren't going to listen to us next time.
Well, that's true too. We really have to think about that next storm. I've heard people say just do a really broad evacuation, go way beyond the border, and just err on the side of caution. I get that, but if you've lived in these vulnerable places, if your residents feel like they've unnecessarily evacuated 2 or 3 times, it gets really hard to evacuate them next time when they maybe really need to.
Absolutely. I'm not sure if it was you or if it was another colleague of mine that told me that there was a lady they spoke to during Ian that had evacuated for 3 or 4 previous storms and decided this time was like, I'm just staying. And
This was a British woman I talked to. She had been there 31 years. She said she has evacuated for all the storms and she's just sick of it. She's tired of it. Again, in her perception, each evacuation was unnecessary. This time the water came up so fast, she panicked. Her friend down the street had a 2-story house. She had a 1-story house. She swam in the rapidly moving 4 feet, 4 feet of water, but it's moving rapidly. This isn't like a swimming pool. This is like a river. And she actually made it to her friend's house and survived. But you hear these stories where people panic and they die trying to swim somewhere, to go somewhere. So, but she had obeyed all these other evacuation orders. So it does get tricky. I mean, these are complex stories. And this brings me back to one of the last questions I want to ask you. A common concern I hear of residents is saying, if I evacuate, I won't be allowed back in. And there are a couple reasons why people want to get back in quickly. Number one, they may feel like burglars may come and loot their property. They may feel like, if I do flood, I want to get on treating that flood, that my building, my house, right away before mold and mildew sets in. I don't want authorities setting up a perimeter saying I can't go into my own house for a week. I can understand from emergency management perspective, there's often a statistic that sometimes more people die from the indirect impacts from a storm. They get electrocuted. They all these other things, animal bites, carbon monoxide poisoning from generators. A disaster zone, even after the storm, is still a very dangerous place. How do we balance that out? How do we think about this? I can understand both sides of it. Walk us through maybe even how a long restriction of not allowing people back in may discourage them from evacuating in the future.
Sure. It's no surprise that my whole career has been communicating. So, to me, it seems like, the start to the resolution for this is to have these conversations with the residents to, when I worked in the State Operations Center in Georgia, we had, we worked Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Michael, and we got lots of the calls at the State Operations Center, people saying, I want to go back to my house. And here's why, and listed all of the things you just said. But when we would explain to them, when we would just take that moment on the telephone as they're calling in and say, listen, we understand that you want to get home. We totally empathize. But right now, if we let you back in, like, we can't keep you safe. We cannot keep your family safe. And there's no electricity. We don't have the means to get food in to feed you if all of your food has spoiled. If you are in a car accident or have a heart attack while you're back in there, we don't have the ambulances or the hospitals up and running to take care of you. And as soon as we would say that, they would go, oh, well, that makes sense. And again, not every time, but as soon as it was explained in a way, and a lot of people always call me kind of like the communication chameleon, even right down to dialect and accents. Whoever I'm talking to on the phone, within like a minute, I will be using their dialect and accent. And so I really kind of chameleon and mimic and mirror being one of them, even using their accents and dialects, and just explaining it to them in a way matching their vocabulary and their language. You can't do that on social media. You can't do that in a press conference, but that's a big lift. Having those conversations at the right time is a heavy lift. So, and it's no surprise that government agencies are short-staffed and have other pressing missions. But I think conversations need to happen on blue sky days, or anytime really. But those conversations need to happen so that people understand, like, we're not just being mean. We're not just like, nope, you can't get back in, we're busy. It's genuinely like, we're tasked with keeping you alive. And there are real risks inside of that barricade that we can't protect you from.
Brandy, something I really got from your perception today is when the storm's coming, paint for them what that storm situation looks like with meteorological conditions, but also after the storm. You're not going to have electricity. You're going to be in a hot, dark house. You're not going to have plumbing, right? That's something that people just assume. They flush their toilet, it works. Their kitchen sink works. You may not have that for a long time. And like you said, there's a curfew. There's no way to provide any emergency services. Maybe painting a picture of this is what this actually looks like. Some people really struggle to grasp the long-term recovery. Like, this may be weeks or months until these services are restored. Maybe walking them through what it looks like can help.
When I first came into emergency management, and well, I'd say maybe the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a shift. I don't know exactly when it happened, but it used to be like, okay, if you're going to ride out a storm, have 3 days worth of food, make sure that you have battery packs for 3 days worth of cell phone charge. Like 3 to 5 days was kind of the magic number. And now I've seen a shift to be prepared to live completely on your own for a week or two or longer. And I don't know that messaging has been around long enough for it to really permeate people's understanding and mindset. They're like, oh, I've got some cans of food, we'll be out of power for a couple days, I'll take some naps. No, this is like, all of your food is going to spoil. Your toilets may back up, which becomes a public health crisis and sewage wise. Your public safety and ambulances may not be running. So let's just say you're out back chopping wood for a fire and you slice the axe through your foot. You're kind of on your, there's so many just normal everyday life things that can happen that 911 and public infrastructure cannot support.
Yeah, these layers, these safety nets that we're so used to just assuming that they're not there in a time like this. There was one of our podcast guests on the last podcast went into Fort Myers Beach the morning after Ian. There were people, a lot of dead people, a lot of people severely injured. There were people actively looting and ransacking. And his thing was like, where was law enforcement? You can make the argument, look, they said this is a mandatory evacuation and they can't put their people at harm's way. So it can be this really chaotic scene. I wonder if painting the picture of what this looks like post-storm may help people evacuate pre-storm, because sometimes people will ride out a life-threatening storm, barely survive, and now they're like, well, now it's unlivable. They're going to evacuate anyway, right? So why not leave a day or two before and make sure that you save your life, I always
used to kind of joke, and say, if we could just live stream an emergency operations center or a state operations center, no necessarily audio would be needed. But if you could see like a bunch of people walking around doing stuff, working, if you could see that energy on like a live feed, if you would, I think people would understand it better because, you have some weather folks that might be out standing in the storm, which subconsciously gives this notion that, hey, we can stand in the storm. It's fine. This dude's good. And his video guy's good. So we're just going to go out there. Or you might see a press conference, which is well curated and, well programmed and scripted. If you could see, and it's not chaos, it's organized chaos. It looks like an ant farm or an ant pile that, everybody's working to bring food to the queen or something. But if you could see that energy, it's probably one of the most profound, I just got chills thinking about the most profound things to see is all of these people just descending on one place with one mission. Everybody knows what to do and where to go. All politics, everything is aside and everybody is there. But I really feel like if the citizens could see that kind of energy, they might understand the level of danger that's there. And it might restore some faith in public safety professionals.
For sure, friends and colleagues of mine that have worked at EOCs, they'll talk about these long hours, but there's this energy, there's this adrenaline, everyone's working together. That's a great idea to have a little cam in the corner, maybe with audio on mute, but just to show like people are doing their best to respond, but it's overwhelming, right? When you have a lot of your city completely annihilated, how do you respond timely? It's just moment by moment making the optimal choices. But to see that energy, to see local, state, and federal resources are being thrown at this may help encourage people along the way.
Absolutely. And, and the almost lawyer side of me is like, oh my God, like what would that look like? Somebody would be like, oh, that guy walked across the room. He wasn't trying to say, but I really feel like, one of the things that I've told people during disasters and COVID, I said, look, I understand that everybody's tired of listening to elected officials and leaders and big media and all of this other stuff. I was like, and that's fine if you don't trust them, because I don't trust any of them either. I said, but do you trust me? And they'll go, yes, except for my family back in Ida. Do you trust me? Do you trust that I trust the people working on the side of me, that I am there just as much for them and they're there for me? Do you trust the little people? And they'll go, the people that are like you, the blue collar workers, like, do you trust me? I'm nobody. And they'll go, yes. And I'll go, great, because we're the people that are actually working the storm. So, just have your trust in the little people. And, I'm not telling you to ignore the big people, but just know there's little people like us, hundreds of us, that are working really hard to save your life.
Yeah, and as you're building those relationships, I like the term you use, blue sky days, right? You're using those workshops and those engagement times, maybe in February, March, April, to build engagement that you may need during flood season or hurricane season. As those relationships and trust are built, I like what you're saying, that you can reach out to the community as they build trust in you. They can trust, okay, you're connected with people maybe at the state and federal level. They're not, but you're almost a link in a sense, linking those people in the community to all these different resources at different levels.
Absolutely.